Proficient at the age of 14 in all branches of study taught in the school of Montbéliard, he was sent to the Caroline Academy at Stuttgart, where he had remained for 4 years. His favorite study was the science of government, which was one of the 5 different faculties in which the lessons were given at the academy. His great mental endowments were at once recognized by the professors, and by none more warmly than M. Abdel, the professor of natural history, who rekindled in his mind of the young student his early taste for that science. When the revolution broke out, Cuvier was residing in Normandy, where he had met the naturalist Jussier, who discovered his scientific attainments and put him in communication with the savants of Paris. He repaired thither in 1795, when the fury of the revolution had subsided, and by the interest of Jussier and Melun, was appointed a member of the Commission of Arts, and soon after a professor of the School of the Pantheon. For use in the school, he composed a treatise on the natural history of animals, which served as the basis of all subsequent works on zoological classification. From the School of the Pantheon, he passed to the Museum of Natural History, where he filled the chair of comparative anatomy. When Bonaparte returned from Egypt in 1808, he was secretary to the National Institute. The revolution of the 18th of Brumaire made the victorious general first consul and led him to assume the title of president of the institute. This made him acquainted with Cuvier, who vacated the post of secretary for the chair of natural history, wishing in 1802 to remodel the system of public instructions. Napoleon named him one of the 6 inspectors who were directed to establish lyceums in the principal towns in France. His commission directed him to Bordeaux and Marseilles. He established lyceums in the cities and returned to Paris shortly before Humboldt made it to his personal abode. Pierre Simon Laplace, the world-renowned mathematician, was born in Normandy on the 23rd of March, 1749. Of his youth, nothing is related except that he was remarkable for his talents. He achieved his first success in theology, which he soon abandoned for the study of geometry. To perfect himself in the science, he came to Paris with the letters of recommendation to D'Alembert. He presented himself at the house of the philosopher, but could not succeed in reaching him. Finding his recommendations useless, he sat down and wrote to Lambert a letter on the general principles of mechanics, astonished at his profundity. D'Alembert, in his turn, waited upon Laplace. "Sir," said he to the young geometrician, "you see that I pay little attention to recommendations. You have no need of them. You have made yourself better known. That is sufficient to me. You may command my support. In a few days, he had Laplace appointed professor of mathematics to the military school of Paris. The wind of good luck blowing from 18th of Brumaire made Laplace Minister of the Interior, his talent for statesmanship not being equal to his talent for mathematics and geometry. He resigned the portfolio of his office to Lucien Bonaparte. He was then created a senator, then vice-chancellor, and at length chamberlain of the Conservative Senate. Of his various scientific writings, especially of his immortal work, the Traité de Mécanique Céleste, he shall not speak here, neither shall we pursue him through his subsequent career. An anecdote of his last days, and we have done with Here, Simon Laplace. You have made many splendid discoveries, Marquis, said a friend to him as he lay on his deathbed. What we know is of little matter, the dying philosopher murmured. What we do not know is immense. Of Dominique Francois Jean Argot, the celebrated astronomer and equally celebrated friend of Humboldt. No sketch is necessary here, as most readers are familiar with his biography. It will be sufficient to say that he was at this time engaged in measuring the arc of the meridian, a famous and dangerous epoch in his life. Of Biot and Gay-Lussac, their balloon ascensions and magnetic experiments we have already spoken. Among these men and others of less note, minor lights in the constellation of science, Humboldt took his place as a star of the first magnitude. He was undoubtedly surpassed by some of them in particular departments of study, but in general knowledge, a knowledge of all branches of science and all literature, he has no superior. If indeed an equal, there was no sense of inferiority on his part. He was a king among his peers. Once fairly settled in Paris, he sat down and mapped out his great work. Had a book of travels been his object, it would have not been difficult for him to have written it within a reasonable time. Many travelers would have done so with Humboldt was thinking about it. A book of travels, however, was not his object. At any rate, not his sole object. It was but a small portion of the task which he completed. He would do himself justice as a traveler by describing the scenes through which he had traveled, the ocean over which he had sailed, the forests in which he had wandered, the rivers he had explored, the mountains he had ascended, the ruins he had seen. But he would also do himself justice as a man of science. He would give them the geology, the geography, the botany, in short, the natural history of the New World. But not in a general way from the vague reports of others, but from his own conscientious observations and researches. Clearly, this was a Herculean task. He divided his material into 6 portions. First, the narrative of his journey, then its zoology and anatomy, then its political aspect. These were followed by its astronomy, magnetism, its geology, and its botany. Knowing that he could not, without assistance, write the multitude of books that such a treatment of his travels implied, he parceled the different portions around among his friends. Arago and Gay-Lussac were to assist him in chemistry and mineralogy, Letriel and Cuvier in anatomy, Laplace in mathematics, Vauquelin and Calaproth in mineralogy, and Bonpland and Cunliffe, not our old friend and his British boyish tutor Christian, but Charles Sigmund Kunth, the professor of botany in the University of Berlin in botany. For his own part, he would superintend their labors and write the narrative of his journey. And now to work, monsieurs, to work they went. As Humboldt laid out his works with great regularity, the reader may suppose that this same regularity attended their publications. But it was not so. Not all those related to and completed one branch of science appeared at one time. They were published as they were written. It could not well have been otherwise with so many hands at work. To know the years in which Humboldt's books were published is to know the nature of his employment at that time. With this clue before we shall trace him during his life in Paris. He came thither, to the reader will remember, in the autumn of 1807. In 1808 was a busy year for him. it witnessed the publication of 2 editions of his Aspects of Nature, one in German, the other in French, of a work on latitude and longitude in Latin, of a work on electric fish in German, and of the first volume his work on equinoxial plants. This last publication, an immense folio with pages 2 feet or thereabouts in length, was the first of a series of works of the same size and kind. They were mostly written in Latin, some by Humboldt, others by Bonpland and Kuhn. In the preface to the first volume of Equinoxial Plants, which prefaces, by the way, was written before Humboldt visited his brother William at Albano. It is dated at Paris, March 1, 1805. He speaks of the labors to which Bonpland and himself were devoted during their 5 years' travels. It says that botanical researches were those with which they occupied themselves most assiduously. A great part of the countries through which they passed had never been visited by botanists. Don Jose Silencio Mutis, director of the botanical expedition of New Grenada, whom Humboldt met at Bogota, where he was the royal astronomer, and to whom he was dedicated the equinoxial plants, had examined before them the forests of Turbaco and the banks of the Rio Magdalena. He did not penetrate, however, the mountains of Quindu, where they obtained some of their rarest botanical specimens. Only one traveler, Joseph de Josue, had preceded them at Loxa. Ruiz and Pavan had examined some of the portions of Peru, but not the province of Juan de Barcelonas, where the vegetation was richest. Cervantes, Cesa, and Mochino had many researches in Mexico, but nature was so unexhaustible in that immense territory that Humboldt and Bonpland obtained many specimens not known to these botanists. The number of equinoxial plants to which the travelers collected in both hemispheres accounted to 200 different species, many of which were not previously known in botany. Their collection surprised the most celebrated botanists. It contained so many new families of plants, much neglected by former botanists. It was especially rich. The equinoxial plants bore on the title page the names of Humboldt and Bonpland. As its authors, most of the work, however, was written by Bonpland, who was highly complimented by Humboldt. His praise of his fellow traveler was as sincere as it was beautiful. "If my enterprise," he said, "shall one day be regarded as interesting in the progress of botany, the success will be as almost entirely owing to the active zeal of M. Bonpland." The work was embellished with great number of designs, which were carefully engraved by Cellier. The second volume of Equinoxial Plants was published in 1809. This and the 2 following years found Humboldt hard at work. He had not yet decided, it would seem, upon writing a regular narrative of his travels, or deciding had postponed it for years longer, until he could see his way more clear before him. He would first work up a few of his lighter materials. His portfolio was full of sketches. His journals was overflowing with astronomical observations. He entrusted the latter to Altamans, a young geometrician of Berlin, who revised them and made all the calculations anew, employing the lunar table of Berg, and correcting them at the same time by the passage of the moon over the meridian. The Institute of France recognized the 700 positions calculated in the number as the greatest mass of materials for astronomical geography then existing, and awarded to Altamans in 1809 the prize for astronomy. His work, a collection of astronomical observations, trigonometric operations, and barometric measurements, was published in 1810 in 2 quarto volumes. Humboldt's own publication this year was the Picturesque Atlas. This was another of the great folios and undoubtedly the most attractive one to general readers. It is not scientific like the accidental plants and his other botanical works in folio, but descriptive and historical. A sort of sketchbook of the New World, it is illustrated by 69 engravings executed by the great artists in Paris, Rome, and Berlin. Such men as Gmelin, Washman, Pinelli, and Massard the Elder. Many of these engravings were made from Humboldt's own sketches, which were taken on the spot's representative. The popularity of the folio Picturesque Atlas induced Humboldt to issue a few expensive editions in 12 months. The title of the folio Picturesque Atlas was dropped, and its subtitles, Views of the Cordilleras and Monuments of the Native Peoples of Americas, substituted. Instead, it soon became a favorite book. If the reader were to imagine Humboldt at that time, he would doubtless picturesque him as a man absorbed in his pursuits and inattentive to everything else, his mind preoccupied, his memory burdened, his days and nights devoted to thought. He would picture him in his study with quires of white paper before him, a pen in his hand, and the floor strewn with pages of blotted manuscript, or in the alcoves of great library taking down ponderous folios or quartos to settle some knotty point. This, we believe, is the usual beau ideal of a scholar, and in some cases it happens to be true one. For Humboldt, it will not answer. It is true that he read deeply in the public libraries of Paris and wrote unwearily in his private study, turning quires and reams of paper into manuscript. The manuscript was not blotted, however, for his handwriting was singularly clean, neat, and ladylike in its delicacy. Nor was his memory burdened, or his mind preoccupied. He possessed himself too thoroughly to be opposed by his work. His nature was large enough to rise above it, gigantic as it was. He would as soon as have gone into society with ink on his fingers as to have betrayed himself as a scholar by any of the cheap signs of scholarship. With the scholar's love of solitude, he had a woman's love of society. He loved it, not because it flattered his vanity, for he had no vanity, but because his nature was eminently a social one, and it revived and refreshed him in his labors, sharpened his insight into life and man. Like his friend Goethe, he was a man of the world, in the noblest sense of that much absurd term. He loved to meet and converse with the distinguished men and women who filled the salons of Paris. Even all its characters, the light-hearted and light-heeled crowd, were not despised by him. He amused himself at their expense occasionally, but it was in such a pleasant manner that they could not be angry. He had a vein of genial humor in him, and when the occasion demanded it, a biting wit. The worst that would be said of him was that he was a little sarcastic. In the salons of Metternich, says von Hagen von Entz, who had met him at Paris in 1810, in the salons of Metternich, At the time Austrian ambassador near the court of St. Cloud, I saw Humboldt only as brilliant and admired meteor so that I hardly found time to present myself to him, and to whisper in his ear a few of the names which gave me a right to personal acquaintance with him. Rarely has a man engaged in such a degree to the esteem of all, the admiration of the most opposite parties, and the zeal of all empowered to observe him. Napoleon does not love him. He knows Humboldt as a shrewd thinker, whose way of thinking and whose opinion cannot be bent. But the emperor and his courts and the high authorities have never denied his impression that they received by the presence of this bold traveler, by the power of knowledge and the light with which they seem to steam from every direction. The learned of all nations are proud of their high associate, of all the Germans of their countrymen, and all the liberals in their fellow. It has been rarely vouchsafed to a man in such a degree as Humboldt to stand forth in individual independence, and always equal to himself and at one with the same time in scientific activity and in the wildest social and international intercourse, in the solitude of minute inquiry, and in the almost confusing brilliancy of the day. But I know of no one with all this, has endeavored throughout his whole life to promote the progress and welfare of our race so steadily, uniformly, and with such ample success. Humboldt published 3 works in 1811, one in German on the geography of plants, another and the first volume of another in French on zoology and anatomy, and another also in French on Mexico. It was his political essay on the kingdoms of the New Spain. The title of the celebrated work gives but a poor indication of its contents. It is not only a political essay in the amplest sense of the word, but a geographical, mineralogical, agricultural, ethnological picture of Mexico as it appeared to Humboldt at the time of his visit. It is divided into 6 grand sections of the book. The first is taken with general considerations of the extent of the physical aspect of the country. The second treats the general population and division of the castes. The third presents a particular statistical view of the intricacies of their population and area. He discusses in the 4th book the state of agriculture and of the metallic mines, and in the 5th the progress of manufactures and commerce. The 6th contains researches into the revenues of the state and the military defense of the country.